everybody, and we are going on with our BA Excellence Conference held by Global BA Community. We are gladly welcoming all of you with us. Thank you all who have who have joined us recently and who have been staying with us from the previous talks, maybe even from the beginning of our conference. We hope that you have already gathered some useful, valuable insights for you from our previous talks, and here is to come another one. We remind you that all conference talks are recorded, and the recording will be shared in a week after the conference. During the next talk, as always, feel free to leave your questions in the chat, and there will be ample time at the end of the presentation to address them with an answer from our speaker. And our next speaker is Elod Herczeg with the topic Breaking the Complexity Code, How Top BAs and Presales Pros Simplify the Unsimple. So he's a well-versed pre-sales consultant who knows what drives both BA analysts and pre-sales consultants, as he has background in both. Also, Elliot has spent 2 years as IT business analyst and has 8 years of experience in international IT pre-sales. Apart from that, Elliot is an avid learner and spends lots of spare time with reading, role-playing, or playing strategic games, and just simply likes to challenge himself in various sports and activities. So please welcome Elliot. Hi, Elliot. How are you?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear
Yeah,
you well.
okay, that's good. Hi Valeria, it's nice to see you again.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So how are you doing? How are you
Um,
feeling about your presentation to be done?
yeah, I'm excited to be honest. Obviously, this is a pretty dense topic. I try to make it clear and concise, but I cannot promise anything. So we will see how it goes. I'm a bit excited. Yeah, let's start maybe.
Great, I sure you will rock it. So please, I'll hand it over to you now, and good luck.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So yeah, welcome everyone. I saw that today we have lots of topics about communication between business analysts and developers and the engineering team. I maybe bring a topic from the same thing, but maybe from a different angle. It's more about communicating with customers, with clients, and really today I want to talk about complexity, to be honest, and to be more specific than that. How complexity appears and affects us as business analysts and pre-sales consultants, and why I think that complexity essentially holds the key in order to progress in our career. So really, this presentation is going to be more of a career advice, if I can put it that way. So let's jump right into it. Let me just go to the next slide. Okay. So the first topic I want to discuss is a little bit of a life journey, how I found out that complexity is sort of the code that is appearing in our job. And then in the next section, I will talk about practical steps that we can take to sort of understand complexity much more effectively. In the third section, I will talk about also practical steps, but more from the angle of talking about complexity. So how we can sort of effectively simplify complexity. And then I will just wrap up and highlight the key points. So to begin with, I would like to ask you to think about what could be the common factor in these three scenarios. So I will read it out loud, all of them, and you will have some time to think about it. Just formulate the answer for yourself, and then I will answer it promptly. So the first one is helping an old lady over the phone configure her Wi-Fi router at 6:30 in the morning. The second one is showing a user how trade agreements work in Dynamics 365 and how to apply various types of discounts based on customers or products. And the third one is describing to a client CIO how a data platform solution would lead to better insights and ultimately an increase in the revenue. So there are two common factors in these, actually, and I will just spoil the first one. So that's the first thing is that I did this, all of these in my career. So the first one as a help desk agent back in the university as a part-time job. The second one as a business analyst or IT business analyst, roughly like 6 years ago. And the third one as a pre-sales analyst, roughly like 3 months ago. And so what really struck me recently is that I was thinking about, okay, how to move forward in my career, how to become more senior, what should be the next step. But what really struck me is that there is a common theme in my career, and that is about complexity. To be more specific, I recognize that essentially what I do is I explain complex topics to people in a very simple way in order to help them understand the topic. And so I think that was a really powerful discovery, because now I had this sort of like different perspective on my career, and then it became obvious how I should move forward. So I started to compare myself to my mentors, to my like bosses, to more senior people who I think work much more effectively and who I think are much more like much better professionals. And I also recognize that essentially they do the same thing but much more effectively. So they understand complexity on the one hand, and also they help others understand complexity. So what do I mean by these? The first one is that they look all-knowing, and what I mean by this is that um, essentially when I approached senior business analysts, they immediately, so it didn't matter what type of problem I was approaching them with, but they immediately knew the answer. They knew what I need to do. They provided like pretty good feedback on that. And it really struck me like, okay, how can you know this, all of this? And the funny thing is, the funny thing was that there were some cases when the business analyst didn't really have like previous exposure to a certain module in the software, but just because he had like this very high level understanding of the system, he sort of knew where I should look for the potential solutions, and that was really like impressive to me at that time. The second thing is that their logic is driven by common sense. And what I mean by this is that their logic is highly relatable. When when they explain complexity and the problem, it's really like usually it strikes me that okay, so if it's that easy, how come I didn't understand it so far? Yeah, it seems like that their logic is very structured, and I was trying to sort of mimic that, but then I failed a couple of times. If we move forward, and that's on the other side, they communicate highly effectively, and what I mean by this is that it looked to me that they can convey lots of meaning and lots of content in a very short amount of time. So in most cases, with just a single sentence, they manage to sort of convey lots of meaning, and they managed to influence where the discussion was going. And lastly, what I also noticed is that they're very mindful about the audience. And what I mean by that is it seems that they have this sort of innate ability to understand the level of knowledge in the audience, and they can sort of adjust the message, the depth of the message, in accordance to the audience's taste. So they don't talk about complexity in very like complicated terms, but they can adjust that. And so when I recognized all these kind of aspects, I was thinking that okay, maybe it's because they're more intelligent than I was. Maybe it's because they're just more experienced. Maybe it's a personality thing. Maybe it's an innate ability, they born with this. Maybe it's just because of their environment, and they got shaped by the previous like environment. But then I thought to myself that okay, this must be learnable, and I sort of set out to prove this. And I had to, essentially, because when I started at EPAM 5 years ago as a pre-sales consultant, I was immediately in the deep waters. So I was so a little bit of side note here. Typically, a bidding process takes anywhere between 1 week to 2 week to prepare like a proposal. And so what I faced at EPAM is that essentially I need to work on a very dispersed environment. I need to work with various types of domains. So for example, when I started, I remember I had to work on a proposal about a data platform solution on AWS, and it was for a pharmaceutical company. Then as I moved forward, I had to work on a mobile application. And you will see that as I move forward, I encountered many different types of domains. And so, yeah, I was really struggling with that at first. I was working on an RPA project. I was working on code refactoring proposals, implementing BNPL, buy now, pay later services for retailers, ERP system related proposals, digital factories, technical assessments. And this is just a small amount or just a small subset of the types of opportunities that I was working on. And so, as I said, at first it was really gruesome. It was really hard. I was really struggled because essentially I honestly I didn't really understand completely what we are proposing and what the client problem was. And so over time I sort of developed some approaches and some practical steps and actions that sort of helped me understand customer problems, understand all these different types of domains, and also help me talk about our solution and the benefit of our solution and how our solution would solve these business problems for the clients. And then over time, I sort of recognized that I was getting much more comfortable with this, and it sort of instead of like thrown into the deep waters and struggling to stay alive, it turned out to be more of like a drown-proofing exercise to me. So really, today, what I will just tell you is exactly about these approaches that I developed over the years to tackle complexity, to understand these highly complex problems and systems, and to talk about these more effectively. So the next section will be about how we can understand and tame complexity. So first, before I just highlight the steps and explain those, I think it's fair to just clarify a few things. So the first one is, what is complexity? To me, obviously there is a very scientific definition, but to me, complexity is a system characteristic where a large number of components, interdependent components, are connected based on a number of fundamental rules that once we understand, we can sort of guess or predict the behavior of a system. And I think, as I just put it in the previous section, I think this is a very good differentiator of a good consultant, like the capacity to understand complexity quickly and then talk about them. So these are the steps that I sort of developed. I will tell you about each one by one, but before I do that, just one more side note. So let's see a couple of examples. So if we think about complexity as a scale, on the very beginning of that scale, we can probably talk about software systems because there are usually a finite amount of components involved. These components are connected based on like mathematical rules. And obviously these are written by developers. So it's like it was written by people. So it should be easy to understand. If we progress on this scale, the next example could be anywhere something like an industry. Usually there are much more components involved in an industry. The human factor also appears much more explicitly. And as we move forward, you will see that more and more components are making up these systems, and more rules are appearing between those. And in the very end, as many experts consider the human brain, so that's the most complex system in the universe. But just for the sake of this presentation, I really like us to focus on the first part of this scale, which is software systems and industries, only because this is what I worked with mostly, and because I think here there are much less number of components. Components are driven by clear rules compared to the other side, where the human factor appear, and there are many. So it can happen that because of free will and because of the autonomy, it's very hard to predict how, for example, the stock market will behave. So what I'm proposing here is not a silver bullet, but I would say probably it's a good start, especially for aspiring business analysts and pre-sales consultants. Okay, so let's talk about the steps now. So the first one is a guiding principle that will help us understand complexity. And it's really about taking a step back. As a business analyst, I remember I was really struggling at first, because when I was working with Dynamics 365, I was really trying to maximize certain areas inside of that system. So for example, creating sales orders, I wanted to learn everything about creating sales orders, every kind of unique case and exceptional case, and it just wasn't effective enough. So what I did is essentially I decided to, okay, let's step backwards and let's see how the system behaves from a bird's eye view, basically. And that sort of enabled me to understand the higher purpose of this system, understand what sort of major components there are in the system, and it sort of gave me a much more holistic view on the features, and it helped me understand and just create sort of a mind map of the system. And then once I understood that, it was really helpful and impactful, and I sort of managed to predict what features can there be in the system. So I think this is a very crucial principle, and I think this is something that we should remind ourselves every time when we struggle to understand something. So the next step that I usually do is I always try to steepen the learning curve. By if you apply the guiding principle, you take a step back, you see the system on a bird's eye view, and then it's sort of some patterns will appear inside the system, and you can use those patterns because then you can sort of deconstruct the system, and then you can sort of focus your attention on the areas where you're not that comfortable. So this is what I did, for example, with Dynamics 365. So once I had this holistic view, I managed to deconstruct that, and I gained a little bit of knowledge in every part of that, and that's sort of the sum of all of this knowledge added up to be much more than that. So this is what I think we should strive for. Also, online courses and trainings, so those can be also used to steepen the learning curve. I really like the books, for example, these 4 Dummies books or the 101 books, because essentially what they are doing is, they are providing this step back to you, and you can see the system as a whole. If it comes to industries, I like to use reference architectures, for example. I really like the way that reference architectures show me the crucial process categories and the crucial aspects of an industry. For example, when I worked with airlines, I remember keenly that I used the reference architecture every time, and it helped me understand what we are doing and why. And just maybe one more side note. So if you have access to experts, so if you work with senior developers or architects, use the power of feedback. So ask questions, ask them what's their recommendation to learn about the system. And if you have a certain knowledge, but then they come in and say something otherwise, then ask questions. Why you think that's the case, and then try to understand their perspective, because that can influence your learning curve as well. So the next thing, and this is very powerful, I think, it's about critical questions. So what I like about critical questions is the fact that what they do essentially is they force us to take a step back on whatever we do. So I remember when I was working on a diagram so it was a proposal, and I was really struggling with one slide, and then I approached my team lead and asked for some support from him. And he immediately jumped in and asked me these critical questions that I should have asked from myself. So, for example, he asked me, why do you struggle with that? Explain why you struggle with that. Explain what you do, what you want to do with that. Why do you think that this will sort of answer what you want to do? So, these questions forced me to not focus on that one slide, but focus on the higher purpose. So focus on what my intention was with that slide. And it's a really powerful tool. So if we go down on this list, for example, if there is a client request and you don't understand that, you can simply just ask what's their higher purpose with that. How does it fit in their strategic agenda? Why do they want to do it like that? So these questions are not easy to answer, but lets you or puts you in the perspective where you need to be. One more side note here. So these questions can be also used as a sort of a presentation tool, I think. And what I mean by that is that instead of like telling the client what you want them to think, you can just ask the questions, and they will, if you ask them correctly, then they will arrive to the same conclusions. And it's always better to influence people and to gain this conclusion rather than you telling them what to think. Focus on critical questions. These are very good tools, it will help you a lot, I think. So the next thing, and it's also a sort of a trick I usually do, is keywords taxonomy. I remember when I started with EPAM, and I started with a data platform solution. I was completely uneducated in this domain. So I didn't work with data platforms before. I didn't know anything about that. So what I did is essentially I created this mental map, this sort of taxonomy, using the keywords of the system, of the data platform. And this sort of enabled me and forced me to sort of understand each keywords in depth. And then I created these sort of hierarchies. And as I created the hierarchies, it sort of helped me understand how the system as a whole behaves. And that's sort of the guiding principle, right? So take a step back and see how it behaves on a higher level. And just one tip, and this is I managed to forget about this, but I urge you to keep it in mind. So put extra focus on keywords that can be easily confused. For example, data cleansing with data transformation, data analytics with data analysis. Because if you don't have the correct definition and you mess up this sort of taxonomy, then later you will probably struggle when you need to add like an extra keyword or an extra topic there. So just focus on this and try to get your head clean and get the definitions right. And just one additional thing to this is that I usually in OneNote write a dictionary for each of these keywords, like a definition. And as I write them, I sort of immediately learn them as well. So that's also a good way. So I'm not just looking on Google, I also write them down for myself. And the last tip in this section is about note taking. So obviously it's a topic that everyone is doing. I but I think we need to find a way that is effective. And I myself like to think that less is more. So I don't usually just write verbatim. I try to give it some structure. I try to give it some visual kind of pattern to my note. And I remember back in the university when I had to prepare for my exams, what I did is that I borrowed 2 or 3 notes from my classmates, and I sort of used those to develop my own little notes. And as I created my notes, I sort of recognized that I immediately learned the subject as well. So I had to spend like much less time with actual learning. So this note taking is really is a tool to learn rather than just saving for later. And a couple of ideas that I typically do is I do mind mapping. So, for example, when I'm in a client meeting, I like to draw sort of a mind map. So, for example, if we are talking about challenges, I like to write in the middle what's the key challenge, and then the rest. I try to give some structure to it. Also, process diagrams. So, obviously, your BAs. I don't think that I need to explain these. So these are also a powerful tool. It helps you with understand how a system would behave. It forces you to ask the right questions. And also I would recommend you to develop an effective way to take notes. So this is what I do. I usually on the right hand side I just write my meeting notes, and on the left hand side I write any kind of question that comes into my mind while I'm writing down the notes. And on the very bottom, I usually just write a summary after the meeting, just to help my head understand what just happened. And typically, by the way, I use either OneNote, but if I have the chance, I use paper and pen. I think that's the maybe I'm old, but that's the way I do it. Okay, so that's enough, I think, about understanding complexity. Let's move to maybe talking about complexity. And I really like this quote from William James because I think it grasps the essence of what I will just talk to you. So the art of being wise is the art of knowing what to overlook. Because whenever we try to simplify something, there is always something that we need to overlook. And if we are wise, we know what can be overlooked. And I think that's what we should strive for. So now we understand complexity. Let's put that in practice. Let's help others understand also. And I think the second differentiator of a good consultant is exactly this: the capacity to help others understand and see patterns and concepts. And these are the steps that I usually do. So there is also a guiding principle here. That is something that I call layering, and there are some reasoning tricks, and then storytelling. So I will explain one by one. So talking about the guiding principle, there are 3 facts that I think we should be mindful about. So the first one is, according to research, our brain is sort of wired to recognize patterns. The second thing is that we like to understand things, and we like to come to our own conclusions about something. And whenever we discover something, we always feel nice about it. And the third thing is that in the modern era of social media and stuff, people's attention span are really shrinking, and so we need to be mindful, and we need to be very strategic how we communicate, because we need to convey lots of meaning in very short amount of time. So as a good consultant, we need to help the audience recognize patterns in the system, and these patterns can be either real patterns, so like obvious patterns, or you can make up your own patterns. And this is something that I will just show you in a minute. So there are a couple of tricks that I like to do. And this is essentially just diagrams. So the way I like to show patterns inside the system is by using diagrams. So if I want to show how components relate to one another, I like to use mind maps or quadrant charts or Venn diagrams. If it's about more like how a system is built, like what major components it has, then I like something like a pyramid diagram or a circle diagram or a tree diagram. And if it's about process or sequence of events, then Gantt chart, flow charts, funnel charts, so anything like that. So I think by using these diagrams, you can sort of visualize patterns in a system, and that's a very powerful tool because it as just see fact number one. And here's an example. So this is what I did for a client. So I remember we got the request for proposal document from them, and it was like a wall of text. So requirements after requirements after requirements. And so what I did, just for the sake of understanding for myself, is I tried to give it some structure. And this is sort of I would say this is maybe a process diagram or a sort of a flow chart, which shows like, it was about the data platform, by the way, but it shows how the data is going through in this platform. And then what I did is that I took those requirements from the RFP document and I categorized them according to this diagram. And then it gave a much more leaner, much more self-evident like diagram, and it helped everyone's understanding about the subject. So this is, for example, I think it's a good example. So next one, layering. So probably developers have heard about this architectural model called C3 or C4, maybe some analysts as well. But essentially, I think this is a very good and effective tool to sort of apply the guiding principle that I discussed in the previous section, take a step back, because essentially this is an architectural approach where you can show the system on multiple levels. So what do I mean by this? So for example, if I say that I live in the 11th district of Budapest, let's say, so probably those people who are not familiar or who haven't been to Budapest, they don't know where the 11th district is. So then I can say that let's zoom in on Budapest, and there you can see the 11th district. And maybe there are some people who doesn't know where Budapest is on the map. So for them, we can zoom out from Budapest, and you can see it in where it fits in Europe. And this is sort of the essence of this model. And I will show you maybe a more technical example. So let's say that one of our clients wants to implement a data platform solution on AWS. So in that case, this sort of very high level view is called system context diagram. So this is how it would look like. So in the middle, you can see the customer data platform. Then we can sort of illustrate how this platform gets the data. So it pulls data from online sources, from corporate systems, from social media platforms. Obviously, there could be many other factors or aspects. And also it pushes data or exposes data to email systems, to API systems. Also, some of these might interact with users, and users might interact with the customer data platform. So this is really an illustration of where the data platform sits in the corporate sort of environment. And it sort of helps everyone have the same kind of understanding how this system will behave on a high level. So if we want to zoom in to level 2, then we sort of need to look at the customer data platform in more depth. And that could be like illustrated, for example, like this. And this is something that we call container diagram. So here we can sort of create these containers that tries to summarize the key sort of process or the key action that this data platform does. So it starts with some kind of an ingestion process, then there is storage, then there are some analytical like magic happening, and then data products will be used to expose the data. Obviously, we can add some sophistication to this. We can add like a self-service environment. We can add some management components to the data platform. And obviously, it's up to you how detailed you want this to be. So, for example, when I applied this, I remember I was writing like plain text what these containers are doing. You can also use diagrams. You can also use some maybe like break down this further a little bit with some like subcomponents or subcontainers. So it's really up to you, and that sort of helps all so the audience understand what will happen inside of this system. And so if it's still not enough for you, you can always zoom in. So that's what we call component diagram. And in this case, let's use, for example, the ingestion and the storage as the example. So this is really a zoom in on these major containers. So how the ingestion process will look like. Obviously, we can say that there is stream ingestion, there is batch ingestion. These are the components that we want to use on AWS. Obviously, it's just illustration, so probably there are many more, but I guess you understand the logic behind this. For data storage, these are the components that we want to use. For management components, the same. And really, obviously, you can always adjust the sophistication of this. You can add more components. You can add different modules. You can add arrows inside these kind of sub or smaller boxes. Usually, this is highly technical. So typically, you show this to maybe an architect or like a technical leader from the client side. And as I said in the beginning, there is a level 4, but we won't have time for that, I think, to look at it. But that's usually very technical. So it's like how classes behave, how like code is looking. So it's like it's much more technical than this. I don't think that as on a business analyst level, we need to use those. Yeah, so let's move forward. So the next one is a very powerful tool to sort of create impactful arguments. And what I mean by this is that analogies can be used to convey lots of meaning and grasp the essence about the interrelatedness of the things. It can also give some additional context to a problem. So let me just show you a couple of examples that I encountered with, and I think these are very like also memorable, but also impactful. So for example, when we worked on a proposal for this client with code refactoring from assembly to C, so if you're familiar with assembly and C, you know that assembly is a very old language. So it comes from the 50s, I believe, and C is it was originally developed in the 70s. So someone in the bidding team sort of said that it's like moving to the 70s from the 50s. So the client intention was to modernize the software, but then as one of my colleagues put this in this way, it sort of immediately became obvious that this might not solve the underlying business goal. So they want to modernize, but they didn't want to modernize enough. And so, this guy managed to convey lots of meaning and made everyone think about it just by one word, or sorry, one sentence. The next thing, when we wanted to implement this software asset management system, one of my colleagues said that, well, guys, it's not a secret sauce, but just tomato ketchup. So it sort of signed to us that, okay, we might not be as unique as we think we are. So probably we should go back to the planning board and just articulate this better. The next thing, and this is getting more complex a little bit. So we wanted to implement this buy now, pay later service for the retailer. And I remember saying this. So I said that, okay, guys, it sounds like we have wool, thread, a set of buttons, and a knitting needle. And we claim that we can make a suit out of this. And so what I mean by that was that, so we have the components. Maybe we know how to do this, but we haven't done this before. And we don't have like the tangible outcome ready. So probably our sort of end-to-end experience or claimed end-to-end experience might not be articulated enough. And analogies can even work as a presentation or in a presentation as a core message. So for example, I did this sort of Pagoda program presentation. It was for a manufacturing client. And the analogy was that they should behave just like as pagodas behave. So if you are familiar with Japanese architecture, you know that so these structures stand for hundreds of years, and they survive earthquakes, they survive everything, and the secret lies in their structure. So if you want to learn about this, feel free to Google it. I really like, by the way, this analogy, and it sort of grasps the essence that there should be like a central pillar, just as the pagodas have, and then the company's departments would be aligned to this sort of central pillar, and then there is some like flexibility in this structure. So if we move forward, the next topic is this compare and contrast principle. So this is about handling arguments rather than just presenting stuff. I like this principle because it always forces me to think about my audience's perspective. So I always need to formulate what I really want to get out of this. So what I mean by that is, for example, if a client says that your story takes too long to implement, I don't want to implement it, it would eat up most of the capacity. Obviously, you can say that, okay, let's not do it. But if you like the challenge, you can say that, well, let's compare it with an alternative solution. So obviously, you need the feature, but you don't like how we would implement that. So let's discuss how we would implement that. So these are the alternatives, and then you can compare them. And in that case, probably the client will see that maybe it makes sense to implement this. So there is a conversation going on just because you started to compare it with something else. The same is true if you need to negotiate price, for example. So let's say you're an account manager and you need to sort of force a 5% increase. And then what you can do is maybe preemptively, you can say to the client that, yeah, there's going to be a 10% increase, like a substantial increase in price. And then later on, you can say that, okay, I managed to decrease that by half, and now it's just 5%. And then immediately it sort of flips the conversation, because originally it would have been, so the customer would be focused around that 5% increase, and now they are focused on the 5% decrease. So it sort of immediately flipped the equation. And this is something that, for example, real estate companies are doing as well. So typically, they have this kind of overpriced flat in their website. And then as you kind of browse the list of other flats, you inadvertently, you sort of start to compare all the flats and all the prices to that highly overpriced one. And then everything looks like as it's fairly priced. And so you're much more likely to buy something in that case. So yeah, I really think that it's always good to argue. It's always good to start putting everything in contrast, putting everything in comparison. And this is a powerful tool, I think. The next one, and this is the last one, unfortunately, is about stories. So probably most of you have heard about storytelling, the importance of storytelling. So yeah, I'm here to remind you of that. I really like to urge you to go the extra mile and try to make your argument more memorable by stories. Stories are a good way to sort of simplify your message, to make a complex idea smaller or much more digestible. It also sort of breaks the monotony of facts. It's not like slide after slide, but something's happening behind. And also it triggers emotions. And whenever emotions are triggered, that makes it memorable. So let's say a couple of examples. So let's say that you need to provide a presentation about how business analysts and pre-sales consultants can get better in their career. So for example, here you can use the hero's journey sort of archetype of story, which is about a hero who goes on an adventure and then faces some hardship, but at the end rises to the tasks and becomes a better person. So this is what I did in the first section. I tried to do. I'll let you judge that how good it was. The next one is about it's a much more like technical example. So let's say you need to explain how a software product would better compete against a more established or more popular product. So then you can maybe use the archetype of the underdog, which is about a hero who, despite all odds, manages to overcome his adversary through fortunate events or maybe clever thinking or something like that. Or let's say you are interviewing for a project and you want to explain how your previous experience can be useful at this client, although this client is a very different one from what you used to work with. So then you can maybe use this voyage and return type of story, which is about a hero who's thrust into a strange world, a strange place, but he manages to sort of get comfortable with that and then find his way back home. Maybe that's a nice way to do that. And there are many archetypes of stories, and if you like kids tale, then you have some inspiration as well. So yeah, unfortunately we are at the end of the presentation. Just to wrap up the talk, so originally I said that I set out with this goal to prove that this must be learnable. And so nowadays I like to think that this is learnable, and you just need to practice it, and it becomes like perfect, and you will become much more comfortable around the topic of complexity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking and engrossing talk. It was really interesting to hear you. And actually, the first question, I would name it rhetorical question combined with a compliment, because
Ooh,
one of
okay.
our listeners says that, can we please make your talk mandatory training for everyone presenting complex information of any kind? It is brilliant. So
Okay, thanks for that.
yeah,
That's good
your
to
talk is
hear.
really, yeah, encouraging others. That's great. And let's start from the first question we have, a true one for this time. So, how would you distinguish BA from pre-sales consultants? So, what's the main distinctions there?
Mhm. So yeah, obviously I put a parallel between BAs and pre-sales people in this presentation, and the simple reason is because I think both of them essentially do the same thing. So essentially they translate requirements from the client to either the development team or either to the bidding team. So that's one of the parallel between them. But also a little difference is that BAs tend to focus on maybe just one small subset of things, so maybe a feature or maybe like there is a self-contained system, while as a pre-sales, you might encounter with much more strategic type of problems. And it's whenever this word comes in, like strategic, it always means that there is a big complexity there. So it's not self-evident how components are interacting there. I'm not sure I answered the question though, but later I will write my answer if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Please feel free to
Yeah.
add additional information if you want to after the
Hmm.
presentation. Let's move on. And the next thing here is not a question actually, but rather maybe a statement that can provoke some discussion. And
Hmm.
it will be great to hear your comments on this. So our audience says that like your definition of complexity seems opposite to the Cinefan framework. And there is a link where the differences is described. And additional comment there is that what you describe sounds more like complicated rather than complex. So
Hmm.
I would phrase maybe the question out of this comment is, how do you define complex and complicated, and what is the
Yeah.
difference for you maybe?
Yeah, very good question. And honestly, maybe I sometimes interchange these definitions, but to me, complicated is a sort of a difficulty setting. So the opposite of complicated is easy, while the opposite of complex is simple. And things can be complicated. Okay, let me just think about it. It's a very good question. So, complex things can be complicated, but also can be easy to sort of understand. I'm not sure if I explained that nicely, but yeah, overall, I think that the difference is that complicated is always a difficulty setting, like complexity is about how many components there are. So it's basically like how I'm looking for a synonym for complex. Um, uh, the structure itself is very dispersed, and it builds up from very different types of components. So it's not necessarily complicated. It's just there are many parts of this. I hope that helped you with the definition.
Okay, thank you for your comment. And actually there is a link that our listener posted
Mhm.
to read about a little bit about this framework. Maybe you can also comment it
Yeah,
afterward.
yeah. So maybe,
Yeah.
maybe my definition is not the standard one in the industry, but I think to me it worked.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think we'll close with the final question here.
Hmm.
So, have you applied described approach to systems that are more complex than your focus area?
Yeah.
So, something apart from software
Yeah,
systems and
yeah.
industries. And
Yeah,
how do you
I
feel?
applied. I applied. For example, I tried to understand how stock market is working. And so the thing is that you can zoom out on the stock market, but at edges of that, you will see systems, and then you need to look at those as well. So it's like a very it's more complex than I was used to. I applied this type of framework, and I managed to learn about it, but it was a much slower process than compared to like a Dynamics 365 or an industry. So that you can use these, but don't expect that a couple of weeks you will learn this.
Okay, so but anyway, it's like a baseline. Everyone can
Yeah. I think so.
use as
Yes.
a starting
Yeah.
point. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you very much, Elod, one more time. Very, again,
My
insightful and
pleasure.
interesting. And thank you, dear audience, for again posting your questions and being active and staying with us. I also encourage you to stay with us to the next talk. And Our Colombian colleagues, Jean and Milton, will be presenting the topic leveraging unusual sessions for enhanced communication between devs and BA. So please stay with us, stay tuned, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you, Elot, and bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.